If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. What are some eerie and terrifying local stories and encounters involving folklore, mythical creatures, and paranormal beliefs in your area? In Norway, the legend of Stallo. Stallo lived in the netherworld, underground. He would steal babies from their comps and switch them with his own unruly screaming kids, Bing. So if a child would scream and be very loud, parents would assume it was a Bing and leave them out in the cold. Stallo was evil, you see, and he hated humans. He would use his Bing children as a call to predators. Here are humans to eat. Stallo would keep away if the child was protected. Comskool is a silver ball with 5 hops on it, normally on a necklace. It's still a common gift for babies in Sapmi. I still wear mine from time to time. Also, don't disrespect the northern lights by whiling at them, it will take you. The Long Agnes. In some areas of the Bavarian forest, there is a terrible legendary figure called the Long Agnes. You can find her, especially between Erhof and Viktak and around Firth im Wald. The Long Agnes is said to be a scrawny old woman with disheveled long black hair. She is often seen at bodies of water like streams or rivers. There, she washes clothes or combs her hair. Whoever approaches her, she pulls into the water and drowns him miserably. It is also said that she lies in wait for men who go home too late from the pub and then scratches them bloody with her fingernails and comb. People in these parts used to be very afraid when they had to cross bridges at night because they believed that Agnes was lurking under the bridge and would snatch them if they crossed it. According to an old legend, Agnes used to be, when she was still a human being, a very rich, vain, and stingy woman who only cared about her looks and mocked the poor. When she died, she did not go to the kingdom of heaven but had to go around on earth until she repented of her old life. Often, beside the streams and rivers lie torn animals. It is believed that these were caught and killed by the Long Agony. At night in these areas, you can often hear a terrible shrieking at the waters. This is said to be Agnes lying in wait for her victims. There is also a legend in which the long ago Agnes asks for bread rolls. These should be brought to her on the way back. Whoever does not bring her any, she drags him into the water and drowns him. But whoever takes her some, she lets pass with a thank you, God. Huldra. A sort of wood nymph could play tricks on people, usually men, but was helpful to the milkmaidens. She has a cowtail that falls off when she is married. To catch or tame her, you have to throw a piece of steel over her head. She is quite beautiful, and a herd of grey cows and riches follows as dowry. But you better be nice, for even if she is married, she is immensely strong. There is a story of a man who didn't heed her calls for dinner, so she had enough and came into the smithy. She took a glowing red horseshoe out of the forge, straightened it out using her bare hands, and said, "I could easily hurt you if I wanted." She also, in some districts, has a dark erotic trait. If you are capable of satisfying her needs, you will be rewarded with gold. But if you don't, who upon you? And, in Sweden, she has a foxtail. The headless mule from Brazilian folklore always ducked me as a kid because the story I heard was of a woman who was killed for having an affair with a priest and was condemned to roam the country as a fire spirit screaming like a banshee out the fiery neck hole of a mule through the night. That stuff messed me up as a kid, especially because the first time I heard it, we were camping on a farm that trained horses, so I heard horse noises during the night and just couldn't sleep at all. It's time for Appalachia to shine. Anyone heard of Talipo? An old hunter living in the woods goes out with his hunting dogs, desperate for food, and shoots something. He doesn't know what, just that it had bright, glowing eyes, and he shot its tail off. There's not much to eat, but at least he'll have something for dinner tonight. So he goes home and boils it up. Then, as he lays in bed, he hears scratching and sees glowing eyes in the dark corner of his bedroom. It calls out, asking for the return if it's Talipo. He sends a hound to run it off, but the hound never returns. As the night wears on, the creature returns, crying out for its Talipo, and one by one he sends his remaining hound dogs until he's all alone. Finally, without any dogs left for protection, the creature returns. In the pitch black night, its glowing eyes come right up to his face as it calls out yet again for its Talipo. Then the morning comes, and nothing but the chimney of his shack remains. Either way, the creature calls out for its Talipo to this day. My area has a slightly modified version of Bigfoot. Our Bigfoot is nocturnal, extremely violent, and territorial. For food, it decapitates mountain lions and drinks their blood. You're most likely to run into it far away from the nearest town. Most sightings report whistles and screeching in the middle of the night. It is also known to be inhumanly strong and fast. If one of these is mad at you, you're doomed. I'm not sure if I believe in it. On one hand, The idea of Bigfoot is extremely far-fetched. On the other hand, I do have experience with one. I never saw it, but I can't think of anything else that could have caused what happened. Here's the story. I was walking through the woods when I heard knocking noises. They would come in groups of 4 and echo off a nearby mountain. Out of curiosity, I decided to respond by hitting a branch on a log 4 times. After a few seconds, I heard the noise again, but closer. I decided to respond again, and the same thing happened. This time, it was not only really close, but it was also on the other side of me. I don't know how it moved from one side of me to the other in a few seconds, but it did. Then it just stopped. That night, I decided to try hitting wood on a log again to see if the knocking would return. The noise didn't return, but later that night, something large started walking toward my house. I live in the woods. It sounded like it was on 2 legs and had heavy breathing. Eventually it walked away, and I haven't had any experiences like it since. The Stoop is a really strange kind of German werewolf. You all know what werewolves are supposed to do, right? They jump their victim and bite it to death. Well, the Stoop also jumps its victim, but that's it. So let me explain. The Stoop usually lies in wait on a crossroad, a graveyard wall, or a river. It looks like a small dog, and once it has spotted you, it will accompany you on your way. Now the spooky part starts. Once you get careless, the Stoop starts growing. It grows and grows and grows until it finally leaps on your back and simply stays there, still growing, getting heavier and heavier with every step. Since you cannot shake the Stoop off and cannot reach your back, you will eventually panic and run until you collapse. And even if you survive, you will get crazy and die soon after. The Wendigo. I've grown up in Minnesota. I've heard people laugh about Bigfoot, aliens, and other fake monsters that you hear about on the interwebs. These are the sort of stories we tell around the campfire in hunting camp. You laugh about ghosts and have a pint while that one weird friend goes on about witches again. The one we talk about is the Wendigo. Don't. The scary thing about the Wendigo is that, unlike Bigfoot, aliens, or witches, it isn't some faraway threat that you can hide from. The Wendigo is your brother. The Wendigo is your sister. The Wendigo is your father or mother. Driven compulsively mad by the cold that blows from the north wind and a hunger that rots you from the inside out. It hungers for warmth and humanity again, but cannot have these things since it committed the greatest crime of all. It wanders the woods forever. The spirit of the Wendigo rides on the coldest of winds and whispers through frozen pine trees, calling the names of its victims in an unending chant. If you ever hear your name called in the breeze on an icy night, don't listen, just run. The Wendigo was your brother. The Wendigo was your sister. The Wendigo is hungry. The Church Grim is a fairy that takes the shape of a great black hound. It has one job, and that is to guard graveyards. The origins of this creature are a little murky. In some legends, particularly those in England, a Church Grim is created by human hands rather than being born. When a graveyard for a church is being made, the priest will sacrifice a dog and bury it in the graveyard before anything else. The spirit of the dog becomes a fairy and the guardian of the graveyard. In other legends, a Church Grim is a captured fairy dog. There are quite a few throughout British and Irish myths, that is bound once again by a priest to a graveyard to be its guardian. The creature is benign on all accounts, unless you plan to rob the graves it looks over. After that, all bets are off. They have been recorded as being vicious and even deadly toward grave robbers. So, keep grave robbing off of your bucket list unless you want to tangle with one. Skinwalkers. According to Native American belief, they are men who deal with evil spirits in order to become shapeshifters. They then seek out and hunt humans. They do this by trying to lure you away from safety. They will mimic anything or anyone in order to fool you, even people you know. They are not like other cryptids who hide in the dark. They can hunt even in broad daylight. A common trick for them is to hide somewhere out of view and then attempt to call you over to them, using a familiar voice and saying something along the lines of, "Hey, come over here, it's me, or help me please." The big kicker is that while they sound like someone you know, there will always be something off about them. Listen to your gut. As shapeshifters, they can appear to be any animal but seemingly have a preference for ungulates, creatures like deer or elk. Rumor has it that if you have any native blood in you, just the mere mention of its name can attract it. Near where I live, there's the urban legend of the Green Man and the Green Man Tunnel. People would say they'd see a horrifying faced monster in that tunnel at night. He was actually a real guy who was disfigured during the war, and since his appearance would cause issues when he went out, he would go for walks at night, particularly through that tunnel. I even took a trip to the site with a library group when I was younger. It is a spooky place, to be honest. For real supernatural happenings, I've heard stuff at night. Like clear as day, not sleep paralysis or anything, always in those early hours of the morning. Once I heard a voice say hello, wait, and stop. Over the course of around an hour, I was up. Another time I heard a meowing noise coming from down the air ducts. But not like how a cat meows or how someone who is human makes the meowing noise sounds. I didn't sleep after that. In Scottish folklore, there's a shape-shifting river spirit called a kelpie that often takes the form of a horse and lures children to the water, with one of the most common stories told about them being the kelpie and the 10 children. After having already lured 9 unfortunate children onto its back, the kelpie proceeds to go after the 10th. The desperate child's finger becomes stuck while trying to get away, but he manages to cut it off and escape. The already stuck children caught in kelpie's trap are then dragged under the water to be eaten. Basically, it became a story to tell to kids who weren't being careful near the water. In Denmark, 2 of my favorites are the 3-legged horse and the lindworm, post-Christianity version. The horse comes out at night and does horse stuff, i.e., roams around eating grass, nothing malicious. If you see the horse at a distance and think, oh, a horse whatever, nothing happens. However, if you get closer and see it only has 3 legs, its dead eyes, or its sunken skin, then you realize it is the 3-legged horse, and you, or your loved ones, will die soon. You probably have time to say goodbye to your family, but death is coming. The lindworm is a serpent or dragon. If you eat a hazelnut with a worm in it, the worm starts eating towards your heart, and of course you will die when it eats it. But the story doesn't stop here. After you die, it will eat the rest of your insides. As your family and friends gather in the church, nothing happens yet. But during the ceremony, the church bells will start ringing, and the worm will jump out of your chest, like in the Alien movie, and eat all the people present. In Venezuela, we have a few, but the most notable for me will always be El Silbon, the Whistler. His origin story varies depending on which region you ask for the tale, but the always consistent part is that El Silbon is an extremely tall and lanky figure. It's said that if you saw him sitting on a sidewalk, his knees would be higher than his head, whose flesh looks severely decomposed, who wears a hat woven from textiles, and who carries a sack full of bones on his back. Most tales about him tell that he killed his father in a fit of rage and is now condemned to forever roam Los Llanos, a grassland full of plains, with the bones of his father on his back in a bag as a burden for his sin while lurking for his next prey to take their bones from, while still alive, might I add. Some tales even say his feet are backwards so that when people run from him by using his footprints, they are actually going towards him, like a reverse lure. The scary part comes from the thing that gives him his name, his whistle. Most people who you ask about El Silbon give you the same song for his whistle, and it is said that the farther and fainter the whistle is, the closer El Silbon is to you. Needless to say, my grandma scared the crap out of me when I was a wee lad, and she told me scary stories. It's fine, I was a little shit who asked for the stories. I've just been a horror junkie since like 8 years old. I live in Connecticut, so we've got a bunch of random spooky haunted stuff as well as being adjacent to Massachusetts. I think one of the notorious ones is that there's Annabelle, a supposedly haunted Raggedy Ann doll that's kept in an occult museum. It's said the doll is possessed and will act maliciously toward whoever owns it. Recently, there were rumors that it mysteriously escaped the museum, but that was false. We have the Black Dog of Meriden, which is like an apparition of a black dog wandering around that does not bark or leave paw prints on the ground. If you see the dog once, it's a sign of joy and happiness for your future. If you see it a second time, it means there will be sorrow in your future. A third time means there will be a death, whether you or someone you know. That stuck with me as a kid, back when I was super obsessed with paranormal stuff in Connecticut. There's also Dudley Town, a supposedly cursed village here that is off limits for visitors. It's said someone with the last name of Dudley was hanged there, and their death brought crop failures, so the village was abandoned. Due to a bunch of vandalism and trespassers, you can basically be arrested to the fullest extent of the law for coming here, which has led to a bunch of rumors of it being haunted and cursed. There's a cemetery in Massachusetts called Spidergates. It was supposedly a meeting place for Satanists, on a small hill in the middle of the cemetery with a flat top. It's said that there were 2 deaths and 1 suicide on the property. Apparently, if you walk through 7 invisible gates in the right order, you'll be transported to another dimension, and there's a mirror cemetery that can be seen across a nearby river, but you can only see it once. If you see it and look away, it will disappear, and you'll never see it again. Me and some friends checked it out, which is illegal, by the way, but didn't really experience anything. We heard some noises in the woods that my friends said were ghosts, but I was like, it's a forest. With animals. I also remember hearing a story about an army of ghosts that would raid villages in the 1700s. Every time people fired their guns at them, nothing would happen. These ghosts would be chased and escape in unexplainable ways, sometimes just by disappearing right in front of the eyes of witnesses, laughing the whole time. Finally, the villagers started praying, and the ghosts were heard screaming and were never seen again. The creepiest one, in my opinion, has always been the Doppelganger from Bavarian folklore, which is similar to the changeling from Irish folklore except it's not related to fairies. These days, we use the word doppelganger to refer to someone's non-related twin. Someone who naturally looks exactly like someone else without any blood relation. It's a rare coincidence, but that's not the word's original definition. Traditionally, the doppelganger was seen as a sign of bad luck, but those sightings were likely caused by hallucinations since no one who truly believed in this phenomenon would spot themselves in public and not confront the other person unless the other person simply didn't exist. However, there are also superstitions that claim the doppelganger is a non-human entity that can alter its physical appearance to literally become someone else and take their place. It was said that the doppelganger consumed the original person once the transformation was complete. This was used to explain early, misunderstood cases of Alzheimer's. It was also used as an answer to severe depression and violent thoughts that a mother might have towards her children, since it was believed that no mother could ever hurt her own child unless she wasn't truly the mother. The thought of someone in your life being replaced by an entity that only pretends to know and care about you is pretty creepy. The Paji, an American cryptid with a mythological history. It's said to exist in the forests, starting in the East Coast mountains and all the way to Kentucky. Several Native American tribes describe these creatures. They resemble small men, around a foot tall, with gaunt features. Their most prominent attributes would have to be their unusually large noses and shaggy, long, moss-colored hair. The story goes that at one point, the Paji tribes didn't mind humans, but when one was accidentally killed, they went hostile. Now they hate people with passion. They can blend in or become invisible to humans. They can also make basic weapons like poison darts designed to create pain. They use these abilities to torment people or even kill, as they revel in tricking humans to their deaths. The Irish, original Sleepy Hollow. The Dullahan is a headless rider, usually on a black horse, who carries his or her own head under one arm. Usually, the Dullahan is male, but there are some female versions. The mouth is usually in a hideous grin that touches both sides of the head. Its eyes are constantly moving about and can see across the countryside even during the darkest nights. The flesh of the head is said to have the color and consistency of moldy cheese. The Dullahan uses the spine of a human corpse for a whip, and its wagon is adorned with funeral objects. When the Dullahan stops riding, that is when a person is due to die. The Dullahan calls out the person's name, at which point the person immediately perishes. There is no way to bar the road against a Dullahan, all locks and gates open to them when they approach. They do not appreciate being watched while on their errands, throwing a basin of blood on those who dare to do so, often a mark that they are among the next to die, or even lashing out the watcher's eyes with their whips. They are frightened of gold, and even a single gold pin can drive a Dullahan away. I think I saw a folklore creature. This happened back in April. I went to a lakeside cabin with my family to celebrate my brother's birthday over the weekend. The cabin belongs to my sister-in-law's family. It's a gorgeous place surrounded by woods, and I hadn't felt that connected to nature in a long time. The cabin is in a different state from the one I live in, and it was a 5-hour drive to get there. Also, this is a good time to mention that this took place in Brazil. I had spent the whole Saturday playing with my 3-year-old niece. We swam in the lake, played in the pool, and explored under rocks to see what bugs we could find. When nighttime came around, we all had dinner and stayed up late talking, singing, and that kind of thing. I was the first adult to go to bed because I usually sleep early and I was feeling the good exhaustion that comes from a well-lived day. I had planned to wake up around 4 a.m. to make coffee and watch the sunrise from the deck that stretched out into the water. However, I ended up getting up at around 4 a.m. because I couldn't really stay asleep. I had woken up many times throughout the night, and I was having these weird dreams I couldn't really remember. When I decided to get up, all that was left of them in my mind was a name, Matanta Pereira. It's the name of a creature from Brazilian folklore, and I didn't really know why it came to mind because it isn't a very well-known tale in the region I lived and grew up in. The only previous contact I had had with it was from a song that only mentioned its name. I didn't know the story behind it. So I just thought, how weird, and went on with my plans to make coffee and wait for the sunset sitting on the deck. While I was making coffee, I heard my niece crying from the room she was sharing with her parents. I got worried, of course, but I figured her parents would deal with whatever was going on, so I headed for the deck and sat down. My niece had stopped crying. Everything was fine. I was sitting on the deck watching the stars and listening to the sounds of the night, the water against the wooden structures of the deck, the splashing of frogs and fish, the call from nocturnal birds. I was in heaven. I should mention I got my degree in biology with a specialty in zoology back in 2018, and even though I followed a different career path, I'm pretty much still enchanted by nature. While I was at uni, me and my friends would bird watch most weekends, identifying the species and all that. This is to say, I know my way around Brazilian birds. This is important for the story. So there I was, enjoying my coffee and the rest of the night before dawn, when everything became silent. No more animal sounds. It was like the whole landscape had been devoid of life. And in came the sense of being watched. That gut sensation of impending doom. I was really scared. It was like I had been transported to a dying land, and I was next. I had had my fair share of scares while in the woods, but I had never heard nature go silent. I even considered I might have been dreaming at that moment, trapped lucid in a subconscious state of mind. I decided to look back at the house because that's where I felt I was being watched. Maybe someone else woke up and is trying to figure out who's sitting in the middle of the deck in the darkness. When I looked back at the house, I didn't really see anything. Until I looked toward the roof. It was a full moon, and it was bright enough to see it reflecting from what looked like jet black feathers on a massive bird-like creature. I froze instantly. I started searching in my mind for what species of bird that could be, but there was none. It was the size of a freaking person. I couldn't see its beak or face. It was like it was wearing a hooded veil, and only the shape of its head was visible. All I could see was the body, which was bird-like, skinny but sort of flappy, and its wings. It looked like it was adjusting them for flight, waiting for the right moment. I wanted to scream and run away, but I was frozen in place watching this impossible creature. Suddenly, it opened its massive wings fully and flew to the right, towards the woods. Almost instantly, the sounds came back. Frogs, birds, and the water. And the first colors from the sunrise were starting to show. I just broke down crying, feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. I didn't tell this to anyone. But Matanta Pereira was burning in my brain, and when I looked it up, I was floored. The accounts talk about a massive black bird that disrupts people's lives when they make deals with Matanta and don't follow through. I don't know why it was there. If it was after something from a family member of mine who was there or if it was just passing by, all I know is that my niece has been experiencing night terrors that, coincidentally or not, started that night. Brazilian folklore is kind of all over the place and is mostly a mix and match of native, European, and African mythos that come together mostly in a more interesting than scary way. We do have some copycats, such as werewolves, that have their appearances in some local regions. Highlights include the saucy Pereira, a trickster-style creature or spirit that comes mostly from African culture. A mischievous black boy figure lacking a leg using red shorts and a red hat/beanie that pranks people for the laughs of it and travels through a small hurricane, the mula sem cabeça, essentially a mule that has no head and spits fire from the neck up, the curupira, a forest spirit that protects it from those who destroy nature and has an inverted bottom half, the yara, a siren/mermaid-style creature that seduces and adorns man, and the boto rosa, a half-dolphin half-man that can change forms but always keeps the respirator, so he always uses a hat. The Gate of Hiisi, Heidenportti in Finnish, is a big and deep ravine or gorge located in Sotkava, Finland, which was believed to be a Hiisi's nest. There is the legend that at the end of the 16th century, when Russians and Swedes had border disputes on the eastern border of present-day Finland, they persecuted Finns, and some of the persecutors hid in the forests of Kainuu. Once, the persecutors kidnapped a 15-year-old girl from Sotkamo and took her to the forest as a servant maid for the hostess of a hidden forest cabin. The girl did housework in the cabin and planned to escape, so she asked her hostess where Oulu was located, but the hostess only said that the sun rises in Russia and sets in Oulu. And then, one spring night, the girl ran away and set off towards the sunset. Along her escape, she found this big and deep ravine, or gorge, and the girl thought it was so scary that its throat stayed in her mind. She later used this landform as a landmark to guide the villagers to the hidden cabin. After she had reached Sotkamo, she roused the villagers and told them what had happened. All the people of the village went on a revenge trip and burned the cabin and the persecutors inside. And that's how the nest was first discovered, but according to folklore, that was just the beginning. Some time after that, a devil, Pyru in Finnish, or ogre they called Hiisi. The word Hiisi originally meant sacred grove and its spirits in Finland, but later came to mean ogre, started moving in the area and causing some havoc. And from the 17th century to the 19th century, different stories were told about Hiisi's gate, continuing the story of the place even after the times of persecution. For example, Yoko Sormunen from Tipisoha, Sotkamo, told me that he had heard stories about Hizi from his own grandparents. According to them, the great and mighty Hizi lived in Vokatanvara, which was the highest point in the region and a good observation point. Local people originally worshipped this ogre, but everything changed with Christianity, and a church was built in Sotkamo in 1737. The constant ringing of the church bells annoyed the ogre, and it tried to destroy the church by throwing 2 large stones at it all the way from Vokatanvara. But because the people still continued to ring the bells, Hizi had to admit its defeat, gather its household and livestock, game, and move to Hizi's gate. Hizi also took a large gold treasure with it and donated some of it to the friendly deer hunters who guided it to Hizi's gate. Then it hid the rest of the treasure so deeply that it has never been possible to find them. In thanks for that, the deer hunters promised to come every year on the first weekend of July to worship the goblin and offer sacrificial gifts. And the worship and pagan festivities in question, which included balls and offering coins, continued until the 1960s, after which people's interest in worship and local stories began to wane, fade, and die out. However, from the perspective of historians and folklorists, the story about the kidnapped girl is hardly true because, according to these researchers, it is not believable and many similar stories have been told around the world, so it might just be an international loan season with local spices. The name of the place, on the other hand, may originally have meant that the place was a holy grove and, in pagan use, instead of being inhabited by an ogre. The story of the ogre is a typical folk etymological story and nowadays a disappearing tradition in Finland. Nowadays, pagan festivities, sacrifices, and treasure hunting are strictly prohibited in the area of this natural site because Finland wants to protect and preserve it, and the festivals could damage and destroy the area's valuable nature. But you can still visit the national park, founded in 1982, to get to know and admire the crack formation that was torn into the rock by the Ice Age. And this is just one myth from Finland related to Hiisi, Mahinen, Meninkainen, Piko, Troll, and Pyru, Devil. My friend's grandmother grew up in Logie Bay and had lots of stories about the fairies. I will try and pass on what I remember. She never said much about the bread or salt in your pockets, but she did say they would lure you into the woods with irresistible music, so if you heard music, you had to head home right away. If you stopped to listen, they would draw you in like a siren. Also, if you walked in a fairy circle, they would take you. I think I remember that circles in the woods were to be avoided, not just mushrooms. If you walked into the circles, you were asking for trouble. She told stories of children being taken, and when they were returned, they had metal or gold under their skin with no scars or anything. I think she said it had to be cut out. She spoke about a child she heard about who was taken and returned years later without aging, and when they were returned, they were disfigured. I used to love her stories. We used to sit around the table late at night while she drank beer and chain-smoked and told us about the fairies. Gore Orphanage in Vermilion, Ohio, is 15 minutes from where I live. The story goes that during the 1870s or so, there was an orphanage run by a man named Gore. Gore hated kids and hated the orphanage. He locked the kids in the orphanage and wouldn't let them do anything. Finally, he snapped and set the orphanage on fire. All the orphans died. If you go to the remains of Gore Orphanage, you can still hear the screams of the children, smell the smoke, and find child hand prints on your car window. I went and totally saw the hand prints. All that's left is one pillar and some foundations, though. There is an urban legend in Egyptian folklore tales, not ancient Egyptian. A water demon that lures men into canals and water channels. In older times, there wasn't electricity yet in rural Egypt. So people were advised not to wander at night. El Nada, a rough translation would be female caller, would lure men and children to water and drown them. There are other urban legends of demons and demonesses, but this one frightens me the most. Nowadays, urban legends are starting to slowly disappear because there is more light, and farmers tend to live in small towns rather than houses on their farmlands. In my mom's hometown in the Philippines, they have this creature called an aswang. It's a shape-shifting monster that loves to eat people, particularly pregnant women and children. Similar to a vampire, but just more creepy, I guess. My mom told me that they look human during the day, and then at night they change into an animal or monster to do their hunting. They have bloodshot eyes and a long tongue, like a snake. They are also really thin, so they can easily hide behind trees and poles. My mom's friends also used to talk about the aswang as well. They said if you suspect someone is an aswang, you can find out by leaning forward and looking at them upside down to see their true form. Or if you hit them with a stick from a cassava plant, they are vulnerable to it. I also heard some versions where they can cut their bodies in half. The top half can fly around as it has wings, and the bottom half is left behind, hidden somewhere. To get rid of it, you'd need to burn the bottom half. It creeped me out a lot when I was a kid, especially because I went to visit my mother's hometown. I really like Cthulhu. The mythology behind it is just so fascinating and absolutely terrifying because it's a monster that delves deep into existential horror. Not just the fear of death, but the fear of breaking. To live in perpetual agony and irreparable insanity. Cthulhu is a monster that cannot be killed, a monster that, even if you do manage to stop it, would only be temporary. Cthulhu slumbers deep under the ocean waves, waiting to awaken, and when it does, that's it. The world is over. But what makes it even more ducked is that Cthulhu isn't even the actual monster, it's the high priest of the real monsters. Beings are so old and powerful that the only possible way to save yourself from them is to be as unnoticeable and insignificant as possible. It's the idea that not only do gods exist, which are nothing like what we could imagine, but that they are so ancient and so powerful that if they ever found out that we are here on this warm, wet rock, it would be the end for humanity. Simply glimpsing them would drive you to insanity. And so Cthulhu sleeps but is slowly stirring, awaiting the moment to call them. Dear Lady. She's from Native American legend or folklore. She was my absolute favorite growing up, and when I moved more towards the city, I was crushed when people didn't know about her. The basic premise of hers is that she kills unfaithful or bad men. She is an extremely beautiful woman who sticks more towards the shadows at parties and social gatherings and will lure bad or unfaithful men away. When he's found the next day, he'll have been trampled to death. Some variations have her partially eating the men. Some variations say that whenever a man kills his girlfriend or wife, her spirit may come back as a dear lady. Other variations say that she's just a forest spirit that is no longer contained in the woods because she feeds on what is in people's hearts. Goat Man, there's the East Coast version and the version I grew up around in Idaho. In the Idaho version, he's a malicious trickster who taps on windows at night, trying to lure people to open their doors or windows, either for his own benefit or to allow the opportunity for other creatures to enter. If you enter the woods that he dwells in, then you have to leave a gift for him in order to enter with any chance of safety, but the entire time he'll hunt you, and if you show fear or are deemed unworthy, then he'll eat you. Where I grew up, people would tell me about Featherfoot and correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember them saying it was a spirit that was on the lookout for people alone in the bush and specifically wanted to rip and eat the fat from their bodies. It freaked me the hell out when I was a kid. I was a little chubby and felt like a prime target, and honestly, I get goosebumps now thinking about it. There were also people who spoke about Min light experiences they had out on the floodplains. When I moved to Queensland a little later in my life, people there told me about Quinkins, not sure on spelling, and I actually remember seeing them in a children's book now that I think about it. There were short ones and super tall ones. I remember a story a friend told me about a time they went camping and saw very tall, lanky creatures in the woods with reflective eyes staring at them from the treetops. There are also, of course, bunyips and that four-legged creature from that show, The Clever Man, which I've forgotten the name of. There is the Den of Nargun in East Gippsland. It is a cave behind a waterfall in a tributary flowing down through a fern gully leading down to the upper Mitchell River in what is now the Mitchell River National Park. There is a pool of water at the base of the falls that usually blocks the entry to the cave, although it is easily crossed if you are willing to get wet. Prior to white settlement, the Gurnai/Kurnai people of East Gippsland seasonally used the Mitchell River Valley to move up and down from the Gippsland Lakes to the high country in the Victorian Alps. According to them, the Nargun was a monster who lived behind the falls and killed any tribal women who went into the cave. I visited the area fairly regularly when I was young, and about 20 years ago I was talking about it to a young couple, about 20 years old, living in Sale, and was surprised to hear that they hadn't been there. I suggested a day trip there, and the woman mentioned it to her mother, Gurnai/Kurnai, who told her that if she went there, she wasn't to go behind the waterfall as that was men's business. Of course, as soon as we had hiked in, she was first through the pool and behind the falls. From our conversation, I got the strong impression that the site was for secret men's ceremonies and that Nargun's role was to prevent women from spying on the ceremonies. Being a Southeast Asian citizen, urban legend is daily meals and heavily indoctrinated in children, especially in rural areas. I grew up in a village in Java, and I can tell you some of the urban legends, or, I think, supernatural entities. 1. Genderuwo is a big, hairy creature, and it is able to do shape-shifting in human form. Usually it lives in an unoccupied house or in a group of bamboo trees. My grandma had a story about this creature. She told me that once upon a time she had a neighbor whom her husband was working with and finally came home. She and her husband had a romantic time afterwards for a couple of days. Strangely, 2 days later, her husband came home and carried a lot of bags and told her that he just came home from working aboard. She was confused and told her husband, whom she had met before. Several months later, she gave birth to an awful, hairy, and disfigured baby. A shaman took the baby and made a protection spell for her and her family. Basically, gender Yuo is a fusion between Bigfoot and Doppelganger, and it has a lot of libido. 2. Babinspit is a creature that is usually used as a shortcut to prosperity. Basically, you made a deal with Satan to increase your wealth, but Satan needs you to make the sacrifice of your closest family member to become its servant. Usually, they quickly died in the form of pigs, either the head alone or the whole body. My friend actually experienced this in his village. One day, his village was terrorized by missing money and jewelry. The people suspected a village member that somehow they suddenly became rich, but their family became more closed to society. So one day, the village held a night patrol, and my friend spotted a big black pig running amok towards the suspected house. So the villagers and their chief stormed the house and found a grave inside the house. Flooded with anger and curiosity, they opened up the grave and found that the suspect's daughter was in the grave with the body of a human but the head of a pig. As rumors spread, the couple fled to another city, and no one heard about them anymore. 3. Wewe Gomble. This creature usually abducts children who still play after dusk. It is visualized as a woman with long hair, torn clothes, and really big breasts, maybe 100z. Its breasts are so big that the children feel comfortable around them, which makes them hypnotized. Usually, children who go missing come back several weeks later. Sometimes they were found in a riverbed or on the top of bamboo trees. The children who get abducted don't remember a thing about what happened during the abduction. There are a lot of misconceptions about these poor creatures. In the movies, they are usually portrayed as very hostile creatures, and they brutally attack people with no reason. However, some elderly people that I've met said that they only attacked people when people disrespected their habitat. They acted hostilely only to teach people the boundaries of living. I think Bigfoot or Sasquatch is a truth-based myth. Think about this, every culture all around the world has it. In China, they have a reddish one. In Himalaya, they have a white one. Everywhere else, they have brownish or variations. In Costa Rica, there is no exception. Early colonizers called him Opa because they heard him yelling something like that. Then I traveled to Ecuador and asked a friend if they had legends related to them, and he gave me the same Bigfoot description with an indigenous name. Colombia is the same, it can't be a coincidence. I'm from the Central Ozarks and grew up with my great-grandmother telling me about Crybaby Holler. A holler, for anyone who doesn't know, is Ozark SA for hollow, or the low land between two hills. Looking back now, it's obvious the story was told as a boogeyman story to keep the kids from running off into the woods too far. It worked too, because the older folks would always mention it right around the time bobcats would start pairing off to mate, and bobcats would make some hellacious racket when they're doing the deed. It sounds like a woman screaming bloody murder and sometimes like a small child crying or screaming. I've heard the story told several ways, but I liked Grandma Tiny and Dado's way the best. The story goes that after the Civil War, when all the men folks started coming home to the wives and children they left behind, a few were none too happy about finding extra children that were too young to be theirs. Just over in that holler, Grandma Tiny or Dado would point to a couple hills a ways off behind the house. At this point, lived a feller and his pretty wife. They had a baby and lived hard, but well, like most folks did back in those days. They went to church with everyone, and all seemed well. Then one day they got word there was war between the North and South. Now, back in those days, men did their duty. So the able-bodied men, the man with the pretty wife too, left to join the fight. Some went to fight for the South, some to fight for the North, and some became bushwhackers. If y'all don't know much about Missouri history at that time, bushwhackers were groups of men that would get together under one flag or another and engage in guerrilla warfare, most often against other bushwhackers. Bushwhackers were, for the most part, not much better than highwaymen and bandits. In fact, Jesse James and his gang started as pro-Confederate bushwhackers. Well, anyway, this young man left to go to war and left behind his wife and child. While he was gone, people adapted, stayed close through church and other social gatherings, and were able to help each other with farm work and whatnot. Times were tough, but most anyone then had been through worse. Then one night, a group of strangers rode through. They were dirty and ragged looking, but well armed with pistols and muskets, a few repeating rifles, and the feller who called himself the captain even had a rusty saber. A few folks offered hospitality, fearing that not doing so would end in bloodshed, and they were right. A few of these men went out to the holler that pretty wife lived in with her child, figuring a woman all by her lonesome might welcome some manly company if the right price was offered. She refused, and in return, they beat her to death and robbed her of everything they could carry. In the process, the child she had was killed. The bushwhackers left the next day, moving on to greener pastures. A few of the men that were too old to go to war gathered their old squirrel guns and headed out to the holler to check on the pretty wife, and they found what they found. She wintered with another family, and not too long after they noticed she was with a child. She gave birth in the summer and returned to the house in the holler, determined to make it on her own. Not too long after that, her husband returned. He came home and found his child dead and his wife raising another man's child. He took to drinking hard and often. I refused to touch the child or have anything to do with it. He became mean and harsh with his pretty wife. One day, after not seeing the man or his wife at church for some time, the preacher went to check on them. As he followed the path down into the holler, he heard the baby crying loudly and clearly, but as he got closer to the house, the wind shifted, and he was met with the foul smell of rot. The preacher left and came back with the sheriff and a few men from town. They went into the house and found it nearly torn to pieces inside. And they found the bodies of the man, his pretty wife, and that baby. It was clear there had been a fight. The baby's crib was turned over and smashed. Tables and chairs were thrown about and broken. That feller had taken an axe to his wife. He turned his rifle on himself. But that baby, the sheriff said, wasn't hurt in the scuffle. Said it lay there screaming and hollering with none to hear until starvation or dehydration took it. By then, it was clear the bodies had been there a while. But the preacher swore up and down to his dying day that he heard that baby crying, though it couldn't have been alive. Now you can hear it too some nights if you listen really close and the wind is just right. That baby is crying in the holler. If you go in the woods, don't go too far, and if you hear a baby's cry, come straight back here. If a starved to death baby can make a racket like that, the Lord knows what else is out there. About this time, Dad-O would make a sound like a crying baby and scare Jesus out of me. And sometimes some animal or another would make noises outside and scare me even worse. But I never strayed far when playing in the woods. I lived in North Carolina about 5 years ago, and I sought out 2 local legends. The Devil's Tramping Grounds is a big circle in the forest where nothing grows. They say the devil comes up at night and walks the circle thinking about evil things, hence why nothing grows there. Apparently, if you try to stay the night in the circle, you'll wake up outside it with no recollection of leaving the circle. It wasn't as awesome as I thought it would be. It was basically just a litter-ridden campground area. Not even a campground, that's just what it resembled. Not too far off the road in a small forest, not too far in. Nothing special. Brown mountain lights, spook lights, orbs, whatever you want to call them. Orbs are some of my favorite unexplained phenomena, so I went to check them out. It took me 3 trips up there before I finally saw them. It was exactly what I was hoping for, and the general area was gorgeous, so overall, I was super happy with my trips out there. Milling or yokai, a scary encounter. I knew I recognized the word yokai. Before the internet was as big as it is now, me and my brother encountered something. Many years later, I found a notice from Swedish folklore to Japanese kaneki jiji. We used to live close to the Baltic Sea, out in the middle of the forest. We rented it after my mom separated from her abusive boyfriend. I was 18 and my brother was 17, we had been to a party in a neighboring house. I mean, we lived out in the middle of nowhere, it had maybe 12 houses, and that's it. Rich people lived there, and old people had the small houses. Only twice did the bus ever stop on the road during the weekdays, and they usually passed you as they didn't see you standing there. Another way, I was drafted into the military, and some girls chatted me up at the party, rich people's house. I don't know how the conversation started, but I had said something like I wasn't afraid to die, and so on. We were walking home on the woodland path, me and my brother. The time was maybe 3 in the night, 3:30, and he was upset with me because I had said I didn't care if I died. I had a long history of suicidal thoughts as I was abused a lot in school, bullied, and beaten, which took a great toll on my life and happiness. He stopped me at a crossroads. Next to the crossroad, there was a mini wooden bridge over a small stream, which was barely a stream at all. He stopped me because it was close to our house, and he wanted to finish our talk before we got home and woke our mom. So he told me he didn't like me talking like that, and being me, I kept telling him that I didn't care about my life, whether I died or not. I can't say exactly what I said, but that is the concept of it. During our talk, I felt anxious, and I'm not a guy who gets scared. I mean, we had ghostly experiences as kids, knocks on doors, TV turning on at full volume, and as kids, you run around scared and laugh, and nothing else, like could have been something else. Who knows? I live in an old country, Sweden, with an old town, old people, old folklore, and so on. But this day, I felt something was odd. I felt I was being watched, and I remember looking around me and seeing this big toad with big eyes. I thought that the toad was watching me, so I let it go, but just a few seconds later, we both heard a small child cry and yell Papa. We both froze. Again, Papa sounded like a 2-year-old in distress in the middle of the night. Close to the water, the road led straight down to the sea. I was petrified, like I couldn't move. Again, Papa, my brother, said that we needed to help her or him and yelled back, "Do you need help?" His voice echoed, and the reply came from someone who sounded like a 100-year-old angry man. Yes. I was scared, and he was too. We both felt it was odd, and I instantly said, "Why didn't it echo?" My brother looked at me. "Why did it echo when you shouted and not when the kid shouted?" He was equally confused, and I still couldn't move. I was holding my brother's sweater during the first Papa, and he now said, "We need to check the water," and he ran down. I know for sure that if I hadn't held on to his sweater, I would have stayed on the spot because I couldn't move, like I was under a spell. But the moment I was jacked from the spot, I could freely move, just like I always did. I forgot to say that in that moment I felt a fear I had never felt before, and I had been in dire shit many times. The only thing I can say is that it felt like I feared for my soul, like the essence of my being was in danger. We ran down to the sea and onto a small boardwalk, wharf, or whatever it is called in English, and we shouted and yelled, but no one replied. I muttered and said to my brother, "It didn't echo because it echoed all the time when we shouted, and I couldn't let that go. I have high-functioning autism. I know now that when something is off or wrong, it gets stuck in me, and I can't let that go." After maybe 20 minutes of standing there, an old woman came onto the fence. She had heard us shouting and lived in one of the small old houses. She stood there with us, waiting, and told us to point while pointing at an overgrown spot in the water. That woman had been there too, a small one, when she was a kid, and a small child had drowned on that spot, and it has been abandoned ever since. We walked home to my room next to my mom. She woke up and asked why I came home so late, and I just couldn't go to bed without telling her about the odd thing. Now, this is where it gets even more strange. My mom has a friend who is a psychologist. I never cared for that stuff, but I have met her many, many times. She called in the morning because she had a feeling something had happened, and my mom told her that we had heard a small child cry out in the woods. The psychiatric woman then asked all these questions. Where are they standing at a crossroad? Is there water next to it, like a stream? Do you know if any children have died there? And now to the most insane and weird questions she said that made the entire story remain stuck in my head. Did it echo when it cried it? Echo, echo. The one thing I couldn't let go of. And the last thing, the cherry on top, did we talk about wanting to die? It was yes on them all. I had lured something that in Swedish folklore was called milling, a drowned child according to the myth that a child was never baptized, a child drowned by its own parent. That child will remain there, waiting for someone like me, saying they want to die. When that happens, they will drown the person so their souls can be bound together there, so it will not be alone. It's so sad, but so scary. I always imagined a wet blue kid sitting there on a stone, just waiting for my brother to run away so it could walk up to me and drown me while I was unable to do anything but die. She also asked if it all stopped the moment we walked away. As it did. She said all this stuff. If I remember correctly, a crossroads is a place where spirits have more energy and the supernatural has a way to get to us, like a thinning of our worlds. The same is true of door frames and such. She wondered about the stream because that is probably where the kid died. That stream leads right down to that wall, and I mean, it's just 20 to 50 meters. And about the echo, she told us that spirits don't have a voice, they are dead, so they can't talk, they force their words onto us. That's why there's no echo, because it's not a real voice or a real sound. It was for us to hear, for us to hunt, I guess. So, this freaked us both out a lot. We were there, we both knew what happened, a 4-year-old kid turning into a 100-year-old man with an angry voice. Years later, I googled milling over and over and didn't find anything, until Wikipedia got bigger and I found 2 articles about milling. And there is only one account of a milling in Swedish folklore that has been documented. And the dormant kid shouts Papa. It does not mean dad or father. In Old Swedish, it means to be breastfed. The kid was screaming to be fed. It also had a link to Japanese folklore to answer your question about the yokai, Kaneki Jiji. A spirit of an old man that cries like a child. A spirit that will jump onto the back of the person that picks it up and weigh more and more as they try to find the grave of the kid or something and then, in the end, crush the person. Either way. Kid turning to old man. Kid shouting Papa. Oh man. I haven't thought of this for a long time. The Inuit myth about Sedna, the Babylonian goddess Inanna and her descent to the underworld, and the North American indigenous myths about grandmother spider, changing woman, and white buffalo calf woman are all interesting, as are the Wendigo. Jewish demonology is fascinating. The Saint Santa Muerte is multi-layered, and any Mayan or Aztec myths surrounding their deities will send you looking back to all the other pantheons, realizing that everything links together. The Morrigan is an Irish goddess of prophecy, magic, war, and death. She shapeshifts as an old woman washing armor in a fort, and it was said that if you were on your way to a battle and saw her washing your armor, you may not survive. She also protected the people's sovereignty over their land and often picked a side during wars and would try to lend her magic to the preferred victor, or else take the form of a crow and try to confuse or frighten the soldiers from an opposing side. Any Irish mythology is told in cycles and feels a little different than anything I've read. In Welsh mythology, there's a collection of prose called the Mabinogion, which is fascinating to read, and in terms of the storytelling of the gods, it is reminiscent of the prose or poetic Eddas from Norse mythology. Welsh mythology also features the goddess Branwen, whose name means white raven, and several creatures and elements, such as the Coblynau, mythical gnome-like creatures that are said to haunt the mines and quarries of Wales and areas of Welsh settlement in America. Like the knockers of Cornish folklore, they often help miners to the richest veins of ore or other treasures with their peculiar knocking sound. They appear dressed in miniature mining outfits and work constantly but never finish their task. In Slavic areas of Europe such as Poland, Russia, Ukraine, the Czech Republic, etc., there's Baba Yaga and the myth of Vasilisa the Brave. They also have in common a goddess of death, winter, rebirth, witchcraft, and nightmares called Morna. Tiamat is a Mesopotamian goddess who is half woman, half snake, or half dragon. She's a primordial deity who was associated with the sea. There are too many, but here are some of my favorites. Gargowie. There is a legend in France that the gargoyle, a stone statue of a monster, was a dragon. The creature used to live in Rouen, France, but was exterminated by the local archbishop. However, there is also a theory that it was worshipped as a god of water in ancient times. There are various theories about its appearance, but it is said that it has a long neck. Takuskanskin. In Native American lore, this is a type of wind spirit. It is believed that this spirit resides within all moving things in the world as they sway and shift. Leshy is an Eastern European forest spirit. She appears as a person with unkempt hair and a beard, but there is no shadow or sound of footsteps. They can change their height at will. Additionally, when they are about to be seen by someone they don't like, they disappear immediately. Boromet's a plant sheep chimera that appears to have its origins in Jewish legend. In simpler terms, it is a creature that grows sheep instead of flowers on its plants. It seems to sustain itself by consuming the grass of plants that are also a part of its own body. Before I get into my story, I would first like to provide you with some background information that contributes to the story. I am a Native American, and, in my culture, we have many myths, legends, and folklore. One example of folklore in my culture is the Skinwalker. For those who do not know, a Skinwalker can take the form of various creatures. However, they will always be slightly different, like a cat with dog fur or a dog with cat's ears and human eyes. I have been told stories passed down for generations. As I began telling my story, this is a first-hand account, and everything that is being said is true. Now, with that being said, let's get started. When I was younger, my little brother and I noticed an owl was following us around. We had noticed that this owl was not a regular-sized owl. This owl was roughly around 5 feet tall. We had also noticed that it would linger around us and watch us. We had considered this to be normal. We never showed any form of fear or anything to that extent. My brother and I began to develop the belief that this owl was a form of protector. Our mom had mentioned that the owl had arrived around the time we were born and began to follow us everywhere we went. When we were younger, we lived on a farm. Any time we would roam the land, the owl would be around us. Our mom had also told us about how the same owl would sit on the stop sign at the end of the road if we had gone somewhere. When we got closer to our house, the owl would follow the car back to our property. When we turned 13 years old, I noticed that the owl had stopped coming around the house or following us. When I was 16, I ended up getting into a huge argument with my dad, and I ended up staying at my mom's house for a good while. One night I returned to my dad's house. It was my first time being at their house in months. As nighttime began to rise, I noticed the same owl was at the house. Around 3 a.m., I heard the owl outside. I went to check and saw the owl. I waved to the owl and began walking to my grandpa's house. During this time, the bathroom in my parents' house was being worked on, so we had to go to my grandpa's house to use the restroom. As I started walking towards my grandpa's house, the owl began to follow me towards his house. In between the houses, there is a good amount of land, roughly about the length of a football field. As I continued walking to my grandpa's house with my dog, I noticed that the owl was alarmed and began hooting frantically. I looked up at the owl to see where it was, and then I looked down to see if there was anything around the area. As I was doing so, I heard movement in a brush in another field, the same field where the cows were located. I soon began to see a big black mass. This mass is roughly 2 feet bigger than a Shetland pony. My dog had noticed it and began to growl and run. As I was walking towards the gate, I saw a normal-sized black dog that was not supposed to be there. The dog then began to run towards the stables, where my dog ran. After the dog ran away, I continued to walk towards my grandpa's house to use the bathroom. When I was finished, I had gone back outside and noticed my dog was standing on my grandpa's porch, visibly scared and shaking. I patted her to make sure she was okay, and I calmed her down. When she was calm enough, we began walking back to my parents' house. As we were doing so, I heard a noise behind my grandpa's truck, which was roughly 20 feet away from the porch. I had pulled out my knife, which I would use as a form of self-defense if I ever got attacked by an animal. I walked off the porch and approached the truck. As I approached the truck, I noticed a creature standing about 5 feet away from me. This creature looked somewhat like a dog, but it was not a dog. I then remembered that it was the same figure that I saw in the field earlier. After coming out of the stage of shock, I realized that I am standing 5 feet away from a medium-sized creature holding a knife while it's staring me down and growling. One of the first things I noticed was its front paws, but they did not look like normal paws. They were elongated and had a similar look to fingers, and they were more spread out than a dog's paw. I then noticed that its head slowly began to come out of the darkness. I had noticed its eyes, some brown but also whiter around the eye. It then begins to move closer to me. The legs were shaped similarly to a dog's legs, however, the creature's legs were more muscular like a human. I immediately reacted by throwing the knife at its paw. The creature had barely moved its paw fast enough to not get hit. I then hear the owl screech loudly, and the dog looks at me. I'm closing the distance between me and the creature. It then looks up as the owl begins to fly above me and my dog. I had noticed that the creature was distracted by the owl. I had taken this opportunity to grab the knife, and I made an attempt to stab the creature. The creature jumps back to avoid the knife, turns, and runs back towards the field. I can hear the owl flying back towards the field where the creature had run back to. I slowly and cautiously make my way back towards my parents' house. As I approach the gate from the field and into the yard, I hear a yelp and a loud thud, followed by a screech. I looked up and saw the owl fly from the cow field towards a tree sitting in the yard of my dad's house. When the owl had landed, I looked at the owl, and it had looked at me and began to hoot. As the owl did so, I ended up getting a feeling that the owl was telling me to go inside and that everything was going to be okay. The next morning, I woke up and went out to the field where the creature came from. I found a large patch of the brush that was flattened, but there was no blood or carcass from the creature that had tried to attack me. I had also noticed that the owl was not around the property. I am now 22 years old and have not seen the owl or the creature since that night. My dad is still located on the same property that I grew up on, and I do visit the property frequently. After that night, I do not know what happened to the owl or the creature. But one thing that I do know is that this event did occur, and I fully believe that I encountered a skinwalker. I also believe that the owl was there to protect me one last time. I don't know what to think about this story, and I have never shared it because I never thought anyone would actually listen to or believe me, so what better place to tell it than here? My parents are Mauritian, and the majority of my family still lives there. There are many different types of Mauritian people who follow different religions, so their beliefs may be different. It seems like a lot of people believe in the paranormal. A lot of my cousins go and get their palms read. It also seems pretty normal to go to a priest on a monthly basis to check some sort of astrological stuff to see if you'll be okay. If your stars, planets, or whatever are looking bad, the priest will often tell you to do a specific prayer or not eat meat on certain days of the week. In daily life, there are also a few things that people do to avoid attracting evil spirits. You're not supposed to clip your nails after 5 p.m. You're not supposed to whistle if it's dark. If you come home and it's dark, you first unlock your door, turn around, and walk into your house backwards. If you open a new bottle of alcohol, you have to pour a little of it outside of your house before you start drinking. The list goes on and on. As my family were Hindus, there was also a lot of stuff that they believed with regards to dead people. When people passed away, they would keep the body in the house for a day. People would come and cry, and then they would cremate it. The evening of the cremation, all the family would bring their mattresses to one room and sleep in there. If they heard any noises or disturbances, they wouldn't go towards them. It was believed the spirit came to walk around their house one last time. Also, a little bit of rice would be left outside the house with a bowl or something covering it, and the next morning, often an animal track or some sort of sign would be left in the rice to tell you what animal the deceased would be reincarnated as. My grandma is apparently a grasshopper. I have no idea what sign was left in the rice for someone to determine that. Also, if a person who is dead shows up in your dream, you aren't supposed to follow them, even if they tell you to. Apparently, dead family members often appear in my dad's dreams to warn him about things. In Germany, there are a lot of them in the Bavarian forest. In the Rhonachten, the crossroads belong to the devils and witches. They dance here, and one can find out the future from them under certain conditions. This is best done on the following nights of the rough nights: the night of Lucerne, the night of St. Thomas, the night of Christmas, New Year's night, and the night of the Epiphany. One sits down in the middle of the crossroads and draws a circle around oneself with Epiphany chalk. One can also sprinkle salt in a circle around oneself, but the circle should not be too small, so that the devils and witches cannot grab one. They must not cross the circle. At midnight, the following can happen. You can see the next year's processions pass by the crossroads at 12 o'clock, funeral processions, weddings, and so on. Of course, it may be that you see your own funeral procession pass by. Crossroads leading to a cemetery are best if you want to see the funeral processions, and crossroads leading to inns if you want to see a wedding, since this is really what will happen at that crossroads the next year. Or at midnight, the witches and devils appear on the crossroads, dance, and celebrate with each other. If you then ask them out of your circle what will happen next year, they have to tell you the future. But since you disturb them in their celebration, they are very angry, and they try with all means to pull the troublemaker out of the circle to do something to him. If they can't grab him, they try to lure him out of the circle with all kinds of promises. Whoever believes them and steps out of the circle is lost. In most of the legends that revolve around this, the people who experienced it were very disturbed for the rest of their lives and did not want to tell anything about what they had seen because they had been prophesied their own death, which then usually happened soon. Little people, or best known as brownies, as there are several versions of them in many folklore, including Scotland, England, and Native American. I learned of their existence from Native Americans as lore. They're little people, and their height could maybe only reach as far as the knees of an average human. They either live in faraway woods, preferably near a river, or in a household. Little people in a household sometimes cause mischief for fun or if they're insulted, but only if you give them clothes as a present. That is a great insult to them, and they will cause great mischief to you. Sugar and silver are the best things you can offer them as part of a peace treaty, so they'll leave you alone. I've had some weird experiences with them. The only one that really stood out to me was that I was staying in a cabin surrounded by woods and a river. One night, I heard music playing silently, and I began to wonder if it was the little people. Then, all of a sudden, there was a strong poke to my nape. I turned to see who it was, and it turns out there was no one because I was the only one in the cabin. Of course, I offered them sugar as my peace offering, and after that, I was never bothered by them again. To my surprise, not many people I know have ever heard of little people or brownies. As much as they desire for their existence to be as unknown as possible, I think their folklore deserves some recognition. You could also say gnomes are related to the same grouping of little people. I expect they're truly evil-spirited, and I wish to never, ever cross paths with them. There are some really good ghost stories out of Greencastle. The Blue Lantern at the front of Boone Hutch Cemetery, Four Arches Bridge, East College at DePaw, the Victorian Day Spa, which was Brewster's restaurant when the owner was murdered, Edna Collins Bridge. I personally had several really wild experiences at Edna Collins. Edna Collins Bridge was supposedly haunted by the ghost of a little girl, Sarah, who always played in the creek below as her mother drove into town. Her mom would come back and bonk 3 times to let Sarah know she was back, and Sarah would come get in the car. One day, the mother returned, honked, and Sarah did not appear. She had slipped on some rocks in the creek, hit her head, and drowned. The legend says that when you stop on the bridge, turn off your car, and honk 3 times, the ghost of Sarah will climb into your car, and you'll also be followed by some kind of black animal. Not sure how this fits into the story. I have done this quite a few times. Nearly every time, we have all felt a sudden, distinct cold just seconds after honking. Multiple times, my passengers and I have felt a very intense, oppressive type of energy settle into the vehicle. Twice, I've seen something very briefly in the rearview mirror. A friend saw a face in the side mirror that made her scream and start crying. And on at least 5 occasions, I've been followed away from the bridge by a solid black dog, cat, or large bird that made my hair stand up and made me want to speed away. Edna Collins is just outside of Greencastle, near the tiny Clinton Falls. It's worth a visit, if only to see the bridge itself. The town where I went to college had a dormitory known as Swope Hall that was almost entirely unused. It was set up with single rooms, one student per room, as opposed to the other dormitories, which had 2 students per room, and the suites, which were 3 connected rooms with 2 students per room. Typically, the only people that inhabited this dorm were students who had issues getting along with any of the roommates they paired them with, or with students living on campus during the summer. Otherwise, it was typically half-3/4 empty all year and very creepy. The legend says that when the college was first started, one of the biggest donors was the Swope family, hence why the dormitory and some other of the university's assets were named after them. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Back in those days, they didn't have the same safety regulations as they do now, and Mary Swope, daughter, had a nasty habit of eating the chips of paint, lead, so she scratched off the walls. Over the years, her sanity began to wane, and she became more and more violent and erratic. Her parents feared her insanity would cast a shadow over their name, so they chose to lock her up. Of course, doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with her because, again, there was a lack of understanding about the dangers of lead paint. So to protect their family, they kept her locked in her room upstairs. The family began to avoid interaction with Mary as much as possible. They would simply feed her and keep her locked in her room. Even on holidays, they wouldn't let her come out to be with the family. Mary's sanity continued to devolve, and she began to feel betrayed by her family. People who are crazy don't typically realize they're crazy after all. She thought they were being unjust, and before long, she couldn't take it anymore. She leapt out of the only escape available to her, the window. Mary Swope died that night, and shortly after, the surviving Swope family moved away. The family had difficulty finding a buyer for the house, but being the wealthy family that they were, this was no issue. When they were approached about donating to the college, they donated the house and land it sat on. The house was torn down, and the foundation was increased to become the first dormitory on the campus, thusly named Swope Hall. But that wasn't the end of the Swope family's legacy. Over the years, students who have gone into and even lived in Swope Hall have reported a number of strange and unexplained phenomena. Mysterious, cold breezes brush past them. Doors opening or closing unexpectedly. Some have even reported seeing a strange visage of a young girl in an old-fashioned nightgown sitting in the corners of unused rooms. Some have heard strange whispers but were unable to make out the words. One year, for a fundraiser, some students set up a haunted house in the dormitory, and partway through, the fire alarms were mysteriously activated, forcing the fundraiser to end prematurely. The oldest dormitory remains, to this day, one of the college's most mysterious and creepiest places on campus. The story of the Buve Cove. The Buve Cove is typically described as being similar to an elongated or deformed calf with sharp fangs. According to legend, the creature often lurks near fountains, streams, and sewers. The Aachen city sewers and the many thermal springs found under the city have been cited as dwelling places for the Buve Cove. One legend holds that Pippin the Younger slew a Buve Cove as it lay by a spring. In 1902, the city of Aachen erected a statue of the Buve Cove over an old well that had been associated with the monster. This statue was melted down for its metal in World War II, prompting the city to build a second statue in 1967. This statue persists to the present day. The Buve Cove is associated with harassing drunk men. In legend, the creature would ambush intoxicated men at night and latch onto their shoulders, forcing them to carry it around before attacking them. The Chicago area has many local ghost stories and hauntings, but the 2 biggest from my childhood folklore were Resurrection Mary and Cuba Road. Resurrection Mary is a hitchhiking ghost on Archer Avenue just south of Chicago in Justice, Illinois. Believed to be a car crash victim from the 1920s, drivers pick her up, and she disappears from the vehicle when the driver passes a local cemetery. Cuba Road is a local road connecting Long Grove and Barrington, 2 wealthy suburbs northwest of Chicago. Old trees growing over the road and narrow, winding curves make it particularly dark and creepy at night, and people have seen black cars parked, driving, and disappearing near an old cemetery on the route. I only ever drove on Cuba Road twice in my time there, and the uncanny dread is palpable, even though we never saw anything but foggy, humid summer air pressed under the dark canopy grown over the road. Living in Scotland, all our ghost stories are extremely traditional in that they almost entirely come from violence or misfortune. A couple that spring to mind is particularly weird. The headless drummer or piper. This one pops up in a few Scottish castles, particularly in Edinburgh and the surrounding area. The legend usually goes that the piper or drummer had a thing with the lady of the castle, and the lord had him beheaded. However, his headless appearance still haunts the castle, and he can be heard playing sometimes. Usually, if they can be heard, it's a sign that the castle is about to come under attack in the near future. The headless drummer is less weird. Yeah, I realize how this sounds, but the headless piper is just bizarre. You need a mouth of some kind to play the bagpipes. Dunrobin Castle, presumably built by a very successful thief, has a room at the top of that. As far as I know, in recorded history, no one has spent a full night within its walls since the previous occupant, a disobedient daughter, I think, was imprisoned and died there. Guests are welcome to try, of course, but so far, I believe no one has managed it without being forced out of the room at some point by everything from apparitions of a girl to moving furniture to mysterious scratches all over their bodies. I find it fascinating that no one can spend 8 hours without cowarding out. And of course, our local specters, Edinburgh residents, were one of the most haunted cities in Britain, are best known as the Mackenzie poltergeist, a violent spirit that inhabits a mausoleum, quite rare for most hauntings, and the spirits that inhabit the catacombs beneath the city where plague victims were sealed in alive and which trials were conducted. The two best known spirits down there are one of a little girl who wants her mother. People on the tours, particularly those who are parents, have been scared by the feeling of a small hand interlocking with theirs, only to look down and find no one there. The other is Mr. Boots. A malicious, but less violent than the Mackenzie poltergeist, spirit. He likes to stomp around loudly in places and kick and shove people down. Mediums report that when he is supposedly in residence, the little girl fades away, terrified of him. The implication is that he murdered the child's mother and possibly the child as well.